My name is Marko Keskinen, and I'm here to tell what inspires and motivates me in my research and work. The theme of my professorship is water governance, and that is also the topic of my talk today. Why these two themes? Because I argue that they are key for this big question that guides my research. Why, despite all the knowledge, we fail to live sustainably in this one blue planet? I argue water and governance together are key for answering this question, and more importantly, also guide us forward. Let's start with water. Water has three important characteristics that makes it essentially the sustainability check of our human actions in this one planet. The first and most fundamental characteristics is of course water cycle. Water cycle is what makes our blue planet also a green planet. Water flows through land, water, atmospheric systems continuously. And by doing that, water cycle is also an energy cycle, it is a nutrient cycle, and it's a carbon cycle. The fact that water cycles also means that water connects, and it does connect many things. The obvious one is of course different scales, from local to national to regional and all the way to global scale, which brings also different countries together around water. Transboundary water cooperation, water diplomacy have been one of the key elements of my team's research. Water also connects different themes and sectors and related actors, from agriculture and energy to industry and households, and all the way to the environment, of course. But for sustainability, one particularly important connection is actually this one: the three key environmental challenges of our time that our generation has to solve: climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. Climate change ultimately is a water cycle change. And that means that when we talk about climate change adaptation, we talk about water and understanding of its dynamics. But water is also critical for climate change mitigation, because water cycle and carbon cycle are so closely connected. And it also means that the carbon balance and carbon sinks in both our land systems and water systems are very clearly and closely linked with water. Water enables all things living, so obviously water is critical for biodiversity and its dynamics. And then the pollution. From eutrophication to harmful substances, water carries the traces of our actions, for good and for bad. The third characteristic of water is that it's dynamic, it changes. From a planetary perspective, of course, the planetary boundaries is something that we should all start from. 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed, including the freshwater change that includes both blue water and green water, soil moisture that the plants use to grow. And here my colleagues here at Aalto and elsewhere have been doing groundbreaking research on understanding the freshwater change and its dynamics. But water of course changes also at the local scales. In this map we can see the water stress. The water availability is different in different parts of the world, and that causes challenges. And here in the map of Finland, we are reminded how our surface waters are still far away from a desired good state. So 3 characteristics of water: cycles, connects, and changes. This is fundamental to sustainability, and indeed to our ability to sustain living in this one planet. But at the same time, those changes remind us that water is in crisis. We are currently not using our waters in sustainable and equitable manner. And the root cause of this crisis is actually not water, but as the United Nations has repeatedly reminded us, the water crisis is a governance crisis. We are simply using and misusing water and the environment in unsustainable ways. And this of course takes me to the second theme of our presentation: governance. Governance can easily be seen as a quite fuzzy, messy, complex concept, and it is that. But ultimately, there are three key elements that we can look at governance through. First one are the actors, the other one, institutions, and the third one, the interactions. The actors are all those having an interest in an issue, whatever that might be, from a local scale to the national to a global scale. And this, of course, brings in the fascinating aspects of power and politics. Institutions include formal institutions like laws, policies, and strategies, and informal institutions like social norms. And they are important because they set the joint vision for our desired futures, and they also define the rules on how to get there. And how this happens is, of course, through interactions, the theme of the so-called governance machine. Actors form and reform those institutions, whereas institutions then guide and steer the actions of the actors. So this is governance, but how can we then actually characterize governance? Well, surprisingly, I would argue there is loads of similar characteristics to water. And let me give you three examples from our recent research here. First of all, governance also forms cycles. This is from our recent research where we look at the water security and water governance linkages here in Finland and noted the kind of cyclical nature of water governance and related policies. Water also connects. This is from even more recent article where we look at governance actors, venues and issues here in Finland and the kind of intricate networks they form together. And the understanding of these networks also help us to understand the power dynamics that the different actors and themes have around water. And of course, governance also changes. And it changes by using, producing, and co-producing knowledge. We are translating, negotiating, synthesizing, and applying knowledge to understand and change our institutions and forming governance and reforming governance. But why the UN then argues that water crisis is a governance crisis, and as I would argue, why a sustainability crisis is also a governance crisis. Well, this is because we have established wonderful institutions in different scales, from local to national, to regional, transboundary, and global scales. And these institutions guide us forward to well-being and prosperity. But the one thing that those institutions very typically lack is a broader understanding of the environmental implications and impacts that our actions have. When we combine water and governance, it means that water reminds us how critical it is for sustainability, but it is in crisis, as is the entire planet, which then brings in the importance of governance, and the challenge is that the governance lacks the planetary implications and understandings of our actions. This is, of course, a major challenge for us all. But to come to the original title of my presentation, it means also a perfect match, obviously. Because to live sustainably in this one blue planet, we must understand, we must advance, and we must reform both water and governance and do this together. So this is, of course, the important diagnosis, but the question is, what does this mean? How we do this? And this, for me, makes a really strong case for interdisciplinary research on water and governance. It means that different scientists and experts come together from different disciplines and sectors to study together these themes. And here important is also to provide common framework on how to do that. And that framework that we are looking at with our colleagues here at Aalto and elsewhere is very much structured around systems and their transformations. When we look at sustainability, we typically consider two systems. We consider the ecological systems that everything is building on, and then we consider the social system, us humans making our way around here and trying to maintain our well-being and prosperity. I argue there is also a third system here that we need to consider that is critical for both of these systems, and that is the technological systems. That is because technological system is actually important to understand the dynamics of the social ecological systems through the data and analysis it provides. But technological system also provides us hard infrastructure such as hydropower dams that bring well-being but also create strong path dependencies and lock-ins that actually prevent us to change the social ecological systems and their dynamics. So this reminds us about the systemic view. It does remind us that there is fundamental need for transformation. We need to change the ways these systems interact. And there is fascinating ongoing research on transformation, whether it's on sustainability transformation or governance transformations. And this is done in different ways. When we look at the governance, we have the governance systems as a social system, and then we have those so-called systems to be governed. The ecological system first and foremost, but also technological systems. And as I said, both of them actually also transform. They are dynamic, they change their systemic state. And one of the current challenges is that the ecological system, as you can imagine from the planetary boundaries perspective, has already moved to partly a new systemic state. But the technological system and the social systems, while there are transitions ongoing, are still stuck in the old ways that were actually creating the challenges we have today. And this creates tensions between these systems because they are not in balance and in sync. And therefore, understanding these dynamics and changes and driving transformation is critical. So I want to finish with providing you some thoughts on way forward around the research and education we do here at Aalto around these themes. First important thing is to consider the systemic view, as I explained. But it's not enough only to consider systems, but really to understand that there is a need to drive change. And there are different ways of driving that change, but one simple way to consider the different spheres of change is through practical, political, and personal spheres of transformation. Here the idea is that we need practical, technical solutions and joint actions to drive transformation. But those need to happen in the broader political sphere, where the governance structures need to be transformed to really allow more sustainable futures. And all this is embedded ultimately in the personal sphere that includes the values and beliefs of all of us, both individually and jointly. And then the idea is that we use these spheres also to influence the systems, to drive change, to leverage actions on the systems. And now actually, this takes me to another perfect match of my presentation. The first one was the match between water and governance. The other one is between engineering and governance. Engineering is critically important to drive those practical transformational actions. Engineering is also important to defining the current and future technological systems we have. But as I have tried to argue, we need to understand the governance, the broader social context where the engineers operate, to understand how actually the systems operate and what kind of change is needed. That's why I'm particularly happy to be Professor of Water Governance in the School of Aalto Engineering. I believe that this is the place to be to study water governance and more broadly sustainability transformation. Let me finally introduce you to a third figure that actually links to the personal sphere visible in this figure. I would argue that one of the fundamental challenges in our time is that we have not been able to connect the personal, the values and beliefs in right ways to the political and practical spheres to drive change for better. And how that actually happens. It is not through these kind of abstract conceptualizations only, but it is also to bring it more personal, have a more person-focused view on our living here in this one planet. And this clumsy visualization is so-called What Expert. This is taken from the master's program in water and environmental engineering that I have had the pleasure to be a director of for a few years. And here the idea is to remind us that when we educate our future expats, we need to combine their disciplinary expertise, in this sense, lex, with the broader understanding of society and with the arms to grasp the other disciplines and other viewpoints. We need to also maintain a systemic view in our core. But first and foremost, even for engineers as well as for all other experts, we need to be aware of our values and use those values to guide our actions forward for the future vision. And for me, the education and learning has really been the driver and attractor for me to enter academia, and therefore I'm really happy to be able to connect the kind of the research orientation and educational orientation also in my research. I started this presentation by saying that I want to tell you what inspires and motivates me in my research. It is all this, but ultimately it is the possibility to study these things together here at Aalto University. Aalto University provides a great place to study interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary ways, water and its governance and broader sustainability transformation. And it is this opportunity to collaborate and work together with my wonderful colleagues here at Aalto and elsewhere that ultimately inspires and motivates me in my research. Thank you.